Picture this, a 6'2" athletic prince, fluent in 4 languages, composing music, writing poetry, and charming European courts with his wit and grace. This was Henry VIII at 18, when he inherited the English throne in 1509. Contemporary accounts describe him as the handsomest potentate I ever set eyes on, with a complexion fair and bright and auburn hair that caught the light like spun gold. Fast forward 38 years. The same man now weighs over 400 pounds, his legs oozing pus from infected ulcers that smell so putrid his servants draw straws to avoid dressing him. His paranoia has reached such heights that he sleeps with loaded crossbows beside his bed. He's executed 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and turned England's religious landscape upside down. The Golden Prince has become a walking nightmare. How does someone transform so completely? The answer lies in a perfect storm of physical trauma, psychological pressure, and absolute power corrupting absolutely. Today we're exploring the documented medical evidence, court records, and eyewitness accounts that reveal how England's most infamous king became the monster history remembers. Henry's transformation began with what seemed like a routine sporting accident. On January 24, 1536, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, Henry's horse fell on top of him. The impact was catastrophic. According to court physician records, the king remained unconscious for 2 hours in an era when losing consciousness for more than a few minutes often meant death. Dr. Armenstein's 2016 analysis of contemporary medical accounts suggests Henry suffered a severe traumatic brain injury, specifically damage to the frontal lobe that controls impulse regulation and emotional processing. The evidence is compelling. Before 1536, Henry's executions were relatively rare and followed legal procedures. After the accident, the frequency and arbitrariness of his death sentences increased dramatically. But the head injury was only part of the story. The same jousting accident burst a varicose ulcer on Henry's left leg, a legacy from an earlier injury in 1527. What started as a manageable wound became a festering nightmare that would torment him for the rest of his life. Medical historian Dr. Kira Kramer's research indicates these ulcers were likely caused by chronic venous insufficiency, possibly complicated by diabetes. The pain was excruciating and constant. Court records describe Henry's leg wounds being cauterized with red-hot irons, a medieval torture disguised as medical treatment. The smell was so overwhelming that courtiers held perfumed handkerchiefs to their faces when approaching the king. Some accounts suggest the stench was detectable from several rooms away. Pain became Henry's constant companion, and it changed him. Sleep became elusive, his temper shortened, and his decision-making grew increasingly erratic. The athletic king who once hunted for hours could barely walk from room to room. His body had betrayed him, and in response he would betray everyone around him. Henry's medical paranoia reached levels that would make modern hypochondriacs seem reasonable. After his 1536 accident, he became obsessed with his mortality, consulting physicians constantly and demanding increasingly elaborate treatments for his deteriorating condition. The king's medicine chest, preserved in the royal collection, contains over 300 different remedies. These included everything from ground pearls, for melancholy, to powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, for poison prevention, to human skull moss, for epilepsy. Henry spent the equivalent of millions in today's currency on medical treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. His hypochondria manifested in bizarre ways. He required multiple food tasters not just for poison detection, but because he believed certain foods could worsen his condition. He banned mirrors from his presence after 1540, unable to bear seeing his physical deterioration. Henry developed what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe anxiety disorder, complicated by chronic pain syndrome. His sleep patterns became erratic. He would stay awake for days, then sleep for 18 hours straight. His mood swings became legendary among courtiers, who learned to read the signs of his approaching rages. Most dangerously, Henry began to see illness and weakness as personal attacks on his divine authority. When his body failed him, he lashed out at those around him. The man who once prided himself on physical prowess now viewed any reminder of human frailty as treason against his royal person. The creation of the Church of England wasn't a theological revolution. It was the ultimate temper tantrum by a man who couldn't accept being told no. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon in 1533, Henry didn't just break with Rome. He rewrote the entire religious structure of England to get his way. The Great Matter, as historians call Henry's divorce proceedings, reveals the king's fundamental narcissism. His argument wasn't based on canon law or theological principle, but on personal convenience. Henry claimed his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had been married to his deceased brother Arthur, conveniently ignoring that he had specifically sought papal dispensation for this exact issue when they married in 1509. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who eventually granted Henry's annulment, left detailed records of the king's reasoning. Henry genuinely believed God was punishing him for his invalid marriage by denying him male heirs. The fact that Catherine had suffered multiple miscarriages and infant deaths wasn't seen as medical misfortune, but as divine judgment. The Act of Supremacy in 1534 made Henry the supreme head of the Church of England, giving him religious authority that even medieval kings had never claimed. This wasn't about Protestant reform. Henry remained theologically Catholic until his death. It was about creating a legal framework where the king's personal desires became religious law. The financial motivation was equally important. The dissolution of the monasteries between 1536 and 1541 transferred enormous wealth to the crown. Henry seized monastery lands worth approximately £1.3 million, annually roughly £1 billion in today's currency, using religious authority to justify what was essentially the largest property grab in English history. Henry inherited one of Europe's most stable treasuries from his father, Henry VII, who had accumulated approximately £1,250,000 in gold and silver, a fortune that represented years of careful financial management. Within a decade, Henry had spent it all on wars that accomplished nothing except inflating his ego. The French campaigns of 1512 to 1514 and 1522 to 1525 cost over £1 million with virtually nothing to show for it. Henry's obsession with military glory led him to pursue expensive sieges of French towns that were strategically worthless. The 1513 Battle of the Spurs, which Henry considered a great victory, was actually a minor skirmish that cost more in preparation than the entire French treasury contained. By 1526, Henry was forced to debase the English currency for the first time, reducing the silver content of coins by 25%. This provided temporary relief, but created inflation that devastated ordinary English families. The Great Debasement continued throughout his reign, ultimately reducing English currency to less than half its original silver content. The king's spending wasn't limited to warfare. Hampton Court Palace alone cost over £62,000 to build and furnish, equivalent to roughly £50 million today. Henry maintained a court of over 1,000 people, requiring constant expenditure on food, clothing, and entertainment. His personal wardrobe expenses exceeded the annual income of most English counties. When traditional taxation proved insufficient, Henry resorted to increasingly desperate measures. The amicable grant of 1525 was essentially forced taxation that nearly provoked rebellion. The dissolution of the monasteries provided temporary relief, but Henry spent the proceeds faster than they arrived. By his death in 1547, England was effectively bankrupt, with debts exceeding £4 million. Henry understood propaganda before the word existed. As his body deteriorated, he compensated by creating an artistic persona that projected power, virility, and divine authority. The famous Holbein portrait of 1537, showing Henry in his iconic wide-legged stance with an enormous codpiece, was carefully designed to mask his physical decline. The portrait's composition is masterful propaganda. Henry's legs are positioned to hide his ulcers, his clothing is padded to suggest muscle rather than fat, and his codpiece is so exaggerated it borders on parody. Art historian Susan Foister's analysis reveals that Holbein used forced perspective to make Henry appear taller and broader than he actually was. The king's clothing became increasingly elaborate as his body failed. Inventory records show Henry owned over 2,000 items of clothing, including doublets padded with horsehair to create the illusion of a muscular chest. His codpieces were stuffed with sawdust and reinforced with whalebone, creating a grotesque parody of masculinity that fooled no one at court but impressed foreign ambassadors. Henry's palaces were designed as stage sets for royal theater. The Great Hall at Hampton Court was built specifically to showcase the king's magnificence, with a hammer beam roof that drew the eye upward to emphasize Henry's height. The king's throne was elevated on a platform and surrounded by cloth of gold tapestries that reflected light onto his face, creating an almost supernatural glow. Even Henry's handwriting became part of his image management. As his hands became arthritic and swollen, he developed an increasingly elaborate signature that took up entire lines of documents. The famous Henry R signature, with its flourishing loops and dramatic strokes, was designed to project authority even when the king could barely hold a pen. The famous rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, reduces 6 women's lives to their relationship with a monster, but each wife's story reveals different aspects of Henry's cruelty. Catherine of Aragon endured 24 years of marriage to a man who ultimately declared their entire relationship invalid. After their annulment, Henry forbade her from seeing their daughter Mary and confined her to increasingly remote castles. She died in 1536, possibly from cancer, writing letters to Henry that he never bothered to read. Her final letter, signed Catherine the Queen, was an act of defiance that Henry never forgave. Anne Boleyn's execution in 1536 was preceded by a show trial that would have impressed Stalin. Henry had her brother George and 4 other men tortured into confessing adultery with the Queen. Anne was forced to watch their executions before her own. The charges were so obviously fabricated that even Henry's supporters were embarrassed, but the king's paranoia had reached the point where he saw treason in every glance. Jane Seymour died 12 days after giving birth to Edward VI, likely from puerperal sepsis. Henry's reaction reveals his fundamental selfishness. He mourned her as the wife who had given him a son, not as a person who had died serving his ambitions. Within weeks of her funeral, he was already considering his next marriage. Anne of Cleves survived by accepting humiliation. When Henry declared their marriage unconsummated due to her appearance, she agreed to the annulment rather than risk execution. Her survival strategy was complete submission. She called Henry brother for the rest of his life and never remarried, living as a pensioner dependent on his goodwill. Catherine Howard was probably 19 when Henry had her executed in 1542. Her adultery consisted of relationships that occurred before her marriage and possibly one flirtation afterward. Henry passed a law making it treason for anyone to marry the king without revealing their sexual history, essentially criminalizing normal teenage behavior retroactively. Catherine Parr survived by becoming Henry's nurse rather than his wife. She managed his medical care, edited his writings, and carefully avoided any topic that might trigger his paranoia. Her survival required the complete suppression of her own personality in service to a dying tyrant's ego. Henry's execution record reads like a medieval horror story. Conservative estimates suggest he ordered the deaths of over 70,000 people during his 38-year reign, roughly 5 executions per day. The victims ranged from international figures to ordinary citizens whose only crime was disagreeing with the king. Sir Thomas More's execution in 1535 shocked Europe. More had been Henry's friend, his Lord Chancellor, and one of the most respected intellectuals of his generation. His crime was refusing to take an oath recognizing Henry as supreme head of the church. More's final words, "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," became a rallying cry for Catholic resistance. Thomas Cromwell's fall in 1540 demonstrates Henry's capacity for betrayal. Cromwell had been the architect of Henry's break with Rome, the mastermind behind the dissolution of the monasteries, and the king's most effective administrator. When the Anne of Cleves marriage failed, Henry needed a scapegoat. Cromwell was arrested without warning, denied a trial, and executed within weeks. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536 saw Henry at his most duplicitous. When 40,000 Northern Catholics rebelled against his religious changes, Henry promised pardons and negotiations. Once the rebels dispersed, he systematically hunted down and executed their leaders, breaking his word with a cynicism that shocked even his supporters. Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was 67 when Henry had her executed in 1541. Her crime was being the mother of Cardinal Reginald Pole, who had criticized Henry's break with Rome from the safety of Italy. The execution was botched. The inexperienced headsman required multiple blows to kill an elderly woman whose only offense was having a son with opinions. The Exeter conspiracy trials of 1538 show Henry's paranoia at its peak. Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, and his associates were executed for allegedly discussing what might happen if Henry died without a male heir. The evidence was so thin that even Henry's own counsel expressed doubts, but the king's fear of potential threats had overcome any concern for justice. Henry's death on January 28, 1547, was as grotesque as his final years. His body had swollen to such proportions that he required mechanical devices to move around his palaces. The smell from his infected leg ulcers was so overwhelming that his final confession had to be conducted from across the room. The king's corpse presented immediate problems. His body was so bloated with gases from internal decomposition that embalmers struggled to prepare it for burial. They wrapped him in lead sheets and sealed him in multiple wooden coffins, but the pressure continued to build during the funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Henry's coffin exploded during the overnight stop at Sion Abbey, and decomposing royal remains splattered across the hearse. The smell was so horrific that the funeral procession had to halt while servants cleaned up the mess with buckets and rags. The symbolism was perfect. The man who had claimed divine authority ended up as carrion on a country road. Dogs were reportedly seen licking up the remains of the king, who had styled himself as God's representative on earth. Even in death, Henry managed to create chaos and revulsion. The explosion wasn't just a gruesome footnote, it was a fitting metaphor for Henry's entire reign. Like his corpse, his kingdom had been bloated with borrowed authority and artificial grandeur. When the pressure became too great, everything burst apart, leaving a mess for others to clean up. His burial vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, had to be specially reinforced to contain what remained of his body. When the vault was opened in 1813, investigators found evidence of the coffin's structural damage, confirming the explosion accounts that had been dismissed as legend. Henry VIII died believing he had secured his dynasty and reformed his kingdom. Instead, he left England bankrupt, religiously divided, and ruled by a sickly 9-year-old boy. His son Edward VI died at 15. His daughter Mary's reign was consumed by religious persecution, and only Elizabeth I's 45-year rule prevented the Tudor line from collapsing entirely. The king, who had executed 2 wives for failing to produce male heirs, was succeeded by 2 daughters who proved more capable rulers than he ever was. Henry's legacy isn't the strong monarchy he imagined. His transformation from Renaissance prince to paranoid tyrant demonstrates how physical pain, psychological pressure, and unchecked authority can destroy both the ruler and the ruled. The medical evidence suggests Henry's cruelty wasn't entirely his fault. Traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, and possible hormonal disorders all contributed to his behavioral changes. But millions of people suffer similar conditions without becoming mass murderers. Henry's tragedy was that his suffering was combined with the power to make others suffer alongside him.